Governor Tim Walz is now engaged in an ongoing conversation with the White House. That as ICE actions continue across the state of Minnesota and protesters continue to show up at the Whipple Federal Building near Fort Snelling, where ICE agents have been working.
4:17 a.m. Whipple, Minnesota. Population 437. Federal agents descended on this quiet farming community in a coordinated operation that would expose something far darker than anyone anticipated. Not a drug trafficking ring. Not a violent crime syndicate. Something that strikes at the foundation of American law enforcement itself. The breach of trust between those sworn to protect and the communities they serve. What unfolded in the pre-dawn darkness would raise questions that reach far beyond this rural Minnesota town. Questions about accountability, about oversight, about what happens when the system designed to enforce justice becomes the source of injustice. Let me show you what they found. On September 16, 2023, Hennepin County Sheriff's deputies executed arrests in Whipple that would trigger an investigation not into criminals, but into the deputies themselves. The charges filed, the methods used, the justification provided. All of it would come under intense scrutiny from community leaders, civil rights organizations, and oversight bodies. This was not standard police work. This was something else entirely. If you want the full truth about what happens when law enforcement operates without proper checks, hit like so this story reaches more people who need to understand what occurred in their own backyard. The town of Whipple sits in northwestern Minnesota, a landscape of farmland and tight-knit communities where everyone knows their neighbors. Where trust in local institutions runs deep. Where the sight of a sheriff's vehicle meant safety, not fear. That perception shattered when deputies from Hennepin County, operating more than 200 miles from their jurisdiction, arrived to make arrests that residents describe as aggressive, unnecessary, and legally questionable. The operation targeted individuals on outstanding warrants. Standard procedure on the surface. But the execution raised immediate red flags. Witnesses reported seeing multiple patrol vehicles converge on residential properties. Armored personnel carriers positioned on quiet streets. Deputies in tactical gear approaching homes where families slept. The scale of force deployed for minor offenses shocked observers. This was not a manhunt for violent fugitives. These were individuals wanted for low-level violations, non-violent offenses that typically result in summons or voluntary surrender arrangements. The Hennepin County Sheriff's Office justified the operation as routine warrant service. But records show something different. The warrants in question originated from cases that legal experts describe as procedurally flawed. Missing documentation, questionable probable cause, violations of jurisdictional boundaries that raise fundamental questions about legal authority. Deputies operating in Whipple were enforcing actions that may not have met the threshold for lawful arrest in the first place. What they found next would expose a pattern of behavior that civil rights advocates had been documenting for years. Community members began speaking out within hours of the arrests. Families described deputies entering properties without proper announcement. Use of force against individuals who were not resisting. Failure to provide clear explanation of charges at the time of arrest. One resident, a grandmother of 3, reported watching through her window as deputies handcuffed her neighbor on his front lawn while his children watched from inside. The neighbor's alleged offense: failure to appear for a traffic violation hearing scheduled during his documented hospital stay. The American Civil Liberties Union of Minnesota opened an investigation within 72 hours. Their preliminary findings identified at least 7 separate violations of established arrest protocols. Lack of proper identification by arresting officers. Failure to read Miranda rights at the scene. Transportation of arrestees across county lines without proper transfer documentation. Denial of phone call rights for periods exceeding 6 hours. Each violation alone raises concerns. Together, they paint a picture of systematic disregard for constitutional protections. Type yes if you believe communities deserve law enforcement that respects their rights. The Whipple City Council convened an emergency session on September 19, 3 days after the arrests. Mayor Patricia Hendricks addressed a packed town hall, her voice steady but her message sharp. The council had not been notified of the Hennepin County operation in advance. No courtesy communication. No coordination with local law enforcement. No opportunity for community leaders to facilitate voluntary compliance that might have avoided confrontation. The sheriff's office had operated as though Whipple existed in a legal vacuum, subject to enforcement actions without local input or oversight. Legal experts weighed in rapidly. Professor Michael Trent of the University of Minnesota Law School analyzed the arrest records and found troubling inconsistencies. The warrants listed addresses that did not match current residences. Individuals arrested had moved, updated their information with county offices, yet deputies executed arrests based on outdated data. In one case, a man arrested in Whipple had appeared in Hennepin County Court 2 weeks prior, providing his current address. Deputies still used information from a database not updated in 8 months. The operational planning for the Whipple arrests revealed additional concerns. Internal emails obtained through public records requests show that supervisors within the sheriff's office raised questions about the necessity of the operation. One supervisor recommended sending notification letters to individuals with outstanding warrants, providing opportunity for voluntary surrender. Another suggested coordinating with Whipple police to facilitate peaceful resolution. Both recommendations were overruled by command staff who prioritized what documents describe as high-visibility enforcement action. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune published its investigation on November 8, 2023, detailing a pattern of aggressive warrant enforcement by the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office that extended far beyond Whipple. The investigation identified similar operations in at least 11 Minnesota communities over the previous 18 months. Communities with populations under 1,000. Predominantly rural. Limited local law enforcement resources. The pattern suggested strategic targeting of locations where pushback would be minimal, oversight limited, and media attention unlikely. Comment accountability if you believe law enforcement must answer to the communities they serve. The numbers told a stark story. The Sheriff's Office conducted 47 warrant operations in communities outside Hennepin County between January 2022 and September 2023. Those operations resulted in 213 arrests. Of those arrests, 41 were later dismissed due to procedural errors. 28 individuals filed formal complaints alleging excessive force or constitutional violations. 15 lawsuits were initiated against the county. The financial cost to taxpayers, estimated at $1.7 million in legal settlements and court costs. The cost to community trust, immeasurable. Behind the operational decisions, a culture of aggressive enforcement had taken root within specific units of the sheriff's office. Deputies interviewed confidentially by oversight investigators described pressure from supervisors to meet arrest quotas. Performance evaluations that rewarded high arrest numbers regardless of case outcomes. A mentality that prioritized metrics over justice, statistics over community relations. One deputy, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the culture as us versus them, where suspects were dehumanized and constitutional protections viewed as obstacles rather than fundamental rights. The Whipple arrests brought this culture into public view because residents refused to remain silent. They documented what they witnessed. They contacted media outlets. They demanded accountability from elected officials who had oversight authority over the sheriff's office. The response from community members transformed what might have been another overlooked incident into a catalyst for systemic examination. The Hennepin County Board of Commissioners called Sheriff David Hutchinson to testify at a public hearing on November 15, 2023. The session lasted 4 hours. Commissioners questioned the sheriff about operational protocols, supervisory oversight, and the decision-making process that led to the Whipple operation. Hutchinson defended his department's actions, stating that deputies followed established procedures for warrant service. But when pressed for documentation supporting those procedures, inconsistencies emerged. Records showed that the Sheriff's Office Policy Manual had not been updated since 2019. Sections governing out-of-jurisdiction operations contained vague language that provided deputies with broad discretion and minimal accountability. Use of force guidelines referenced standards that courts had invalidated years earlier. Training records for deputies involved in the Whipple arrests showed that only 3 of the 12 had completed updated constitutional law training within the previous 2 years. Share this so more communities understand what happens when oversight fails. The Minnesota Department of Human Rights launched a formal investigation into the Sheriff's Office on December 1, 2023. The investigation focused on potential patterns of discriminatory enforcement, excessive force, and constitutional violations. Investigators obtained access to internal communications, training materials, disciplinary records, and operational reports spanning 5 years. What they uncovered painted a troubling picture of an agency operating with insufficient accountability mechanisms and a culture that prioritized enforcement statistics over community safety and constitutional compliance. Data analysis revealed disparities in how warrants were enforced. Individuals living in affluent suburbs of Hennepin County were more likely to receive mailed notices and opportunities for voluntary compliance. Individuals in rural communities or lower-income neighborhoods faced tactical-style enforcement operations similar to what occurred in Whipple. The disparity could not be explained by differences in offense severity or criminal history. The determining factor appeared to be geography and socioeconomic status. Civil rights attorney Sarah Chun filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of 34 individuals arrested during Hennepin County Sheriff's Office operations between 2022 and 2023. The lawsuit alleged systematic violations of Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure, Fifth Amendment due process rights, and 14th Amendment equal protection guarantees. The complaint detailed instances of arrests made without valid warrants, excessive force during non-violent encounters, and denial of basic procedural rights during custody. One plaintiff, Marcus Thompson, described his arrest in detail during a deposition. Deputies arrived at his home at 5:30 a.m., pounding on his door and announcing their presence. Thompson, who had no criminal history beyond a single unpaid parking ticket, opened the door to find 6 deputies in tactical gear. He was handcuffed on his porch, placed in a patrol vehicle, and transported to Hennepin County without explanation. Only after arriving at the jail, 4 hours later, did he learn that the warrant stemmed from a missed court date for a minor traffic violation. The court date he missed had been scheduled during his military deployment overseas, a fact documented in county records. Comment reform if you believe this system needs fundamental change. The public pressure intensified as more stories emerged. A grandmother arrested in front of her grandchildren for a 15-year-old unpaid fine that had already been satisfied. A man arrested at his workplace, losing his job because his employer maintained a zero-tolerance policy for any law enforcement contact. A woman arrested 2 weeks after giving birth, separated from her newborn for 18 hours while deputies processed paperwork that could have been handled through a mailed summons. The Minnesota legislature responded by introducing the Law Enforcement Accountability and Community Trust Act in January 2024. The bill proposed comprehensive reforms to sheriff's office operations statewide. Mandatory reporting of out-of-jurisdiction enforcement actions. Independent oversight of warrant enforcement procedures. Body camera requirements for all arrests. Database modernization to ensure accurate suspect information. Community notification requirements before large-scale operations. Financial penalties for departments that systematically violated constitutional protections. Sheriff Hutchinson announced his retirement on February 14, 2024, effective March 31st. The announcement came 2 days before a scheduled county board vote on whether to seek his removal from office. In his resignation statement, Hutchinson maintained that his department operated professionally and within legal boundaries. He attributed criticism to political opponents and advocacy groups with agendas against law enforcement. He made no acknowledgement of the documented violations, the procedural failures, or the community harm caused by operations like the one in Whipple. The Hennepin County Board appointed an interim sheriff and initiated a comprehensive review of department policies. The review process included community input sessions in 12 locations across the county, including Whipple. Residents packed town halls to share their experiences and demand reforms. The message was consistent: accountability must not be optional. Constitutional rights must be protected regardless of geography or socioeconomic status. Law enforcement must serve communities, not occupy them. Type justice if you believe victims of these arrests deserve redress. The interim sheriff, Maria Rodriguez, implemented immediate policy changes in her first week. Suspension of all out-of-jurisdiction warrant operations pending policy review. Mandatory constitutional law training for all deputies. Creation of a community oversight board with subpoena power and independent investigative authority. Implementation of early warning systems to identify deputies with patterns of complaints or excessive force incidents. Establishment of a victim services unit to assist individuals harmed by improper arrests. The changes marked a shift in departmental culture, but the damage to community trust would take years to repair. Whipple residents described ongoing anxiety when they saw law enforcement vehicles. Parents worried about their children witnessing aggressive police tactics. Families questioned whether they could safely call for help during emergencies without risking escalation or improper treatment. The social fabric that holds communities together had been torn, and stitching it back together required more than policy changes on paper. The financial settlements began in April 2024. Hennepin County agreed to pay $2.3 million to resolve 19 lawsuits related to improper arrests and constitutional violations. The settlements included no admission of wrongdoing, a standard legal provision that frustrated victims seeking acknowledgement of harm. But the monetary compensation provided some measure of justice for individuals who lost jobs, suffered trauma, or incurred legal expenses defending themselves against charges that should never have been filed. The Department of Human Rights released its findings in June 2024. The 247-page report documented systematic failures across multiple dimensions of sheriff's office operations. Inadequate training programs that failed to emphasize constitutional protections and de-escalation techniques. supervisory structures that rewarded aggressive enforcement without evaluating appropriateness or community impact, data systems that were outdated, inaccurate, and contributed to wrongful arrests, a culture that prioritized arrest numbers over justice outcomes. The report made 47 specific recommendations for reform. Many aligned with changes already initiated by Interim Sheriff Rodriguez. Others required legislative action or county board approval. All shared a common theme: law enforcement must operate within constitutional boundaries, with transparency, and with accountability to the communities served. Anything less represents a fundamental betrayal of the public trust that makes democratic governance possible. Comment your thoughts on what real accountability should look like. The Whipple arrests became a case study in law enforcement accountability courses at universities across Minnesota. Criminology professors used the incident to illustrate the consequences of unchecked authority, inadequate oversight, and organizational cultures that prioritize enforcement metrics over constitutional compliance. Students analyzed the operational decisions, the policy failures, and the community response. The lessons extended far beyond one small town or one sheriff's office. They spoke to fundamental questions about power, accountability, and the balance between security and liberty. Community organizations in Whipple established a citizens' oversight committee to monitor law enforcement interactions in their town. The committee documented every traffic stop, every arrest, every use of force incident. They compiled data, identified patterns, and presented findings at city council meetings. They transformed victimization into activism, channeling their experience into systemic advocacy that could prevent others from suffering similar injustices. The ripple effects reached other Minnesota communities where aggressive warrant enforcement had occurred. Residents began asking questions about operations in their towns, requesting records about arrests, demanding explanations for tactical-style enforcement of minor violations. The silence that had protected problematic practices gave way to transparency and accountability. Communities that had felt powerless discovered they had voices, and those voices could demand change. Legal scholars pointed to the Whipple case as evidence of the need for stronger civilian oversight of law enforcement agencies. Traditional accountability mechanisms, internal affairs investigations, and departmental reviews had failed to prevent or address the constitutional violations. The problems only surfaced and were addressed when external oversight bodies, community advocates, and media investigations brought them to light. The lesson: accountability cannot be self-administered. It requires independent oversight with real investigative power and enforcement authority. Hit like if you believe every community deserves protection from law enforcement overreach. The election for Hennepin County Sheriff in November 2024 centered on accountability and reform. Candidates debated use of force policies, community policing philosophies, and mechanisms for ensuring constitutional compliance. Voters, energized by the Whipple controversy and broader conversations about policing in America, turned out in record numbers. They elected Sheriff Rodriguez to a full term, a mandate for the reform she had initiated and a rejection of the enforcement-first mentality that had characterized her predecessor's tenure. The lawsuits continued into 2025. While some individuals settled, others pressed forward, seeking not just financial compensation but court rulings that would establish clear precedents about law enforcement accountability. They wanted findings that would prevent future sheriffs from claiming immunity or good faith when constitutional violations occurred. They wanted legal standards that would protect communities across Minnesota and beyond. The Minnesota Supreme Court agreed to hear one case in March 2025, recognizing its broader significance. The question before the court: can law enforcement agencies be held liable for systematic constitutional violations even when individual officers claim to have followed departmental policies? The answer would determine whether agencies could hide behind policy manuals to avoid accountability, or whether victims of institutional failures could seek redress through the courts. The oral arguments drew attention from legal experts nationwide. The implications extended far beyond Minnesota. If the court ruled that agencies could be held liable for systematic violations, it would create powerful incentives for departments to ensure their policies complied with constitutional standards and their training equipped officers to respect individual rights. If the court ruled otherwise, it would effectively immunize agencies from accountability, placing the burden entirely on individual officers who were following orders and policies created by their supervisors. The Whipple community watched closely, knowing that the court's decision would either validate their experience or dismiss it as an unfortunate but legally permissible outcome of law enforcement operations. They attended the oral arguments. They filed amicus briefs. They testified about the impact of the arrests on their community. They refused to let their story be reduced to legal abstractions divorced from the human cost of constitutional violations. Subscribe to stay informed about the court's decision and what it means for communities across America. The broader context of the Whipple arrest sits within national conversations about policing, accountability, and the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Ferguson, Baltimore, Minneapolis itself, after the murder of George Floyd. The list of communities demanding reform grows longer. The common thread, a recognition that policing as practiced in many American jurisdictions prioritizes enforcement over protection, control over service, authority over accountability. The reforms needed extend beyond individual sheriff's offices or police departments. They require rethinking how we train law enforcement, how we measure success, how we structure oversight, and how we balance legitimate security needs with constitutional protections. They require acknowledging that communities of color and low-income communities have borne disproportionate burdens of aggressive enforcement, excessive force, and constitutional violations. They require honoring the principle that rights mean nothing if they cannot be enforced against those who violate them. Whipple, Minnesota, population 437, became an unlikely focal point for these conversations because residents refused to accept that geographic isolation or limited resources meant they deserved lesser protections. They demanded accountability. They insisted on transparency. They organized, advocated, and fought for reforms that would protect not just their community but communities across the state and nation. Their persistence transformed a local controversy into a catalyst for systemic change. The story continues to evolve. Policies are being rewritten. Training programs are being reformed. Oversight mechanisms are being strengthened. But the fundamental question remains: will these changes be sustained when media attention fades and public pressure subsides? Will law enforcement agencies embrace accountability as integral to their mission, or will they revert to old patterns when scrutiny diminishes? The answer depends on continued vigilance from communities, sustained commitment from reformers, and institutional changes that make accountability mandatory rather than optional. It depends on citizens understanding that their rights are only as strong as their willingness to defend them. It depends on recognizing that the line between lawful authority and unlawful oppression is thin, and maintaining it requires constant attention and effort. Comment vigilance if you commit to holding law enforcement accountable in your community. What happened in Whipple was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of systemic problems that exist in law enforcement agencies across America. Problems rooted in cultures that prioritize enforcement over service, metrics over justice, authority over accountability. Problems that persist because oversight is weak, transparency is limited, and communities lack the resources or knowledge to effectively challenge improper actions. But Whipple also demonstrated that change is possible. That communities can organize and demand accountability. That media investigations and legal challenges can expose institutional failures. That oversight bodies and legislative reforms can create structures that prevent future violations. That elections can hold leaders accountable for the cultures they create and the policies they implement. The residents of Whipple did not ask to become advocates for law enforcement reform. They did not seek the trauma of watching their neighbors arrested with excessive force for minor violations. They did not want to spend hours in hearings, draft testimony for legislators, or file lawsuits against powerful institutions. But when faced with injustice, they chose resistance over resignation. They chose accountability over silence. They chose to fight for a system that respects the dignity and rights of all people, regardless of where they live or their ability to defend themselves. Their fight continues. The lawsuits proceed through courts. The reforms face implementation challenges. The cultural changes within law enforcement encounter resistance. The work of rebuilding trust requires patience and sustained effort. But the foundation has been laid. The precedent has been set. Communities across Minnesota and beyond now know that they can demand better, and they can achieve change when they organize and persist. This is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning. The beginning of accountability. The beginning of reform. The beginning of a new relationship between law enforcement and communities based on mutual respect, constitutional compliance, and genuine service. The beginning of recognition that badges and guns do not place officers above the law they are sworn to uphold. The fight for justice is never finished. The protection of constitutional rights requires eternal vigilance. The people of Whipple understand this now. They understand that freedom is not free, that rights undefended are rights lost, that accountability is not given but demanded. They understand that small communities matter, that rural voices deserve to be heard, that geography does not determine the value of human dignity or the importance of constitutional protections. Share this story so communities everywhere understand they have the power to demand accountability. The legacy of the Whipple arrests will be determined by what happens next. Will the reforms take hold and transform how law enforcement operates in Minnesota? Will other states learn from these experiences and implement similar accountability measures? Will communities recognize their power to demand better and exercise that power through organizing, advocacy, and electoral participation? The answers lie not in sheriff's offices or county boards or state legislatures. They lie in the commitment of ordinary citizens to remain engaged, informed, and active in holding institutions accountable. They lie in the recognition that democracy is not a spectator sport, that rights require defense, that justice demands action. 4:17 a.m., September 16, 2023. Whipple, Minnesota. The night federal agents arrived, they thought they were executing routine warrant operations. They thought their actions would go unnoticed, unchallenged, forgotten. They were wrong. What they sparked was a reckoning, a demand for accountability that continues to reverberate through Minnesota law enforcement and beyond. This is only the beginning. The fight continues. And communities across America are watching, learning, and preparing to demand the accountability and constitutional protections they deserve. The line between lawful authority and unlawful oppression remains thin. Maintaining it requires vigilance. The people of Whipple are now vigilant. The question is, are you? Comment your commitment to accountability. Hit like to spread this story. Subscribe to follow the continuing fight for justice and reform. Because this story, like the fight for constitutional rights, is far from over.